one of the most evident aspects of your work is your use of kind of real life places once in a while.
Yeah.
How do you develop such a strong ability to kind of take those places and make them your own in this living city?
Yeah. I would say the majority of the settings in the books, not all of them, but probably a majority of them have what I would call real-world analogs, and those analogs are usually right here in Worcester. And where that came out of was, a couple things. One thing is that as a reader, you're a reader before you're a writer, and the kind of reader you are tends to determine, I think, the kind of writer that you grow into. I always very much loved a specific sense of place in books, and I'm very clear that there are a lot of readers out there that don't. I remember I enjoy as a reader, narrative description. I remember after my first or second book came out, my college roommate calling me up and saying, "Oh, all the description in your books, it's like having to read Thomas Hardy again." And I said, "Well, thank you. That's I liked Hardy." What I tend to do is when I'm part of it comes out of my childhood and my teen years. Again, I keep going back to these formative years, but they have determined so much in terms of the writing in the books. I come from I think a long line of drivers. My father, was most content, I think, when he was behind the wheel of his car, and I was most often his co-pilot. So, from a very young age, I spent lots of time just winding aimlessly around the nonsensical streets of Worcester. It's not exactly a nicely gridded out city, and the city seemed, because of that, I think, because I was with my father and because of the nature of my own imagination, I found the city from a very young age. I found it terrifically interesting and intriguing and a little bit haunting, and that was the antithesis of the experience that all my friends had. I've often said, I have vivid memories of hanging around the neighborhood corner with my buddies as a teenager in high school, and everybody just the one topic of conversation that would keep coming back would be, boy, I can't wait to get out of the city. As soon as I get myself together, I'm getting out of the city. And I would always kind of hang back a little bit because I felt like a Judas, because to me, I understood what they were saying, but I saw the city with a different set of eyes. So when I started writing the books, I knew from the beginning that Quinsigamond was going to be my territory, that Quinsigamond was going to be my sort of mythical landscape for probably for the bulk of my work. And so what I started doing was, in the early years, even when I was writing short stories, before I was working on novels, I'd outline, and when I would work up a chapter, figure out what was going to happen in a particular chapter, I'd sort of go to work on where was this going to take place. And then I would, I've gone so far, I've said in the past, if I thought of some place in the city that would serve as as the foundation for a setting, I would, I'd latch onto it like crazy. I remember in the early days, my wife and I would go out and sort of scout locations like a movie scout would do, and she'd take photographs, and while I'd be working on that chapter, I'd have, enlargements of the photos of a building that she'd taken up. I've often said, there are a lot of diners in my books because I love diners, and because there are a lot of diners in Worcester, and if I had picked a particular diner to base a scene or a chapter or a setting on, I'd eat breakfast and lunch every day for 3 weeks, until the chapter was done. I would count the number of coffee mugs on the shelf just to. But then the thing is, so often I find that local readers will either recognize some aspect of a certain setting as originating in a Worcester locale, or have heard from somebody, that diner in chapter 6 is based on this diner. Mm-hmm. And there's often a disconnect, because I had an experience where I was doing a reading and I mentioned in passing that the diner in the chapter was based on the Miss Worcester diner down on Southbridge Street. And afterward, a man came up to me and said, yeah, you said you based that on the Miss Worcester diner. I said I did, and he said, but the owners in your book are, Cambodian, and I know the owners of that diner. It's fiction. I change things, and often I change them wildly. As I think I mentioned to you at one point, the origin of the nightclub in Box 9, I think it was the old Aurora Hotel rooming house down on Main Street. Now, if you read the description of the nightclub and you stand outside on Main Street and look at the Aurora, you might have some trouble, seeing how one got to be the other. But I often say, I start with a foundation, and then I just let my imagination sort of run roughshod over it.
Okay. Kind of going along with the idea of locations in the city, do you feel that, because I looked back at your description and I looked at some of the places that you said were the parallels, and I realized that some of them have actually been redone and remodeled. Yeah, exactly. Like Union Station.
Oh, best example. I often joke that I don't mean this obviously, but I have said that I'm the only guy in the city who was just heartbroken when they renovated Union Station, because that was my bread and butter. I set so many things in there. And Union Station had that comes from a personal, that building and that location has a lot of resonance for me, because for a year I went to, my grammar school closed in 72, at the end of spring of 72, and for my final year of, for 8th grade, my final year of grammar school, I went to a school down on Temple Street, across from the St. John's Church, the oldest church in the city.
Okay.
And to get the bus home, I found one could shortcut through the old Union Station. And I remember the first day I walked in there. I've never forgotten it. Obviously, as you can see by the repeated instances of the setting in the books, it made a big impression. But it was right around that same time, in the early 70s. There were an awful lot of sort of post-apocalyptic, dystopian movies out there, fables. Boy and His Dog, and Zardoz, and I can't even think of them all now. But some of the post-bomb, ruined city movies.
Right.
And I remember the first day I ever walked through the old Union Station pre-renovation. I wandered into one of those movies.
Right.
The other thing I remember about that is that several months later, mentioning my practice of cutting through there in the presence of my uncle, who was a police officer, for 40 years, and he went crazy. He said, "What are you doing, walking?" Smacked me in the head. But yeah, I have above my desk, I have a photograph, really gorgeous photograph that a local, I don't think he's local anymore, but a photographer at the time who was, he was the architectural photographer for the renovation project, or one of them. And he knew my connection to Union Station and sent me a photo that is so striking. It's just, it's amazing. The moon is sort of shining, moonlight is shining through a crack in the ceiling, illuminating just this devastation below. It looks like the photo, and my memories of Union Station in the early 70s, it looks like what I imagine Dresden looked like after the firebombing, during World War II.
Right.
Just this absolute decay and chaos and ruin, and so because of that, because of the strength of that memory and the vividness of that memory, it became just a sort of as soon as I started writing the novels, I knew, things are going to happen in Union Station, or my mount's on Union Station.
Is that photo where the inspiration, the scene where Sylvia in?
Yeah.
Is that the?
Well, what I'll say is that as I was working on that book, I know that I would repeatedly glance up for just to get the feel, that sort of gritty.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because when you started mentioning that, immediately something went off.
There you go. I'm kind of hesitant to go down there. I don't want to lose my. I want to keep it in my head in that sort of post-apocalyptic condition.
Right, because I remember reading your books and just basing off of the Union Station that I pulled in front of. Because I just coming to the city from New York, I hadn't realized exactly when it was renovated. So kind of reading the book and then looking at Union Station, I said, what happened in between here?
Yeah, and it was anyone my age in the city would remember it most vividly in that just devastated condition. It was that way for an awful long time.
Right.
And it was, it's an amazing place. I had the opportunity to wander through there, as an adult, more under safer conditions. And it really was obviously in the book I've made it as haunting as I possibly can, and as eerie and as dangerous, I guess. But when I sort of toured the place, just probably months before the renovation took place, it was genuinely eerie. It was real life eerie. It was there was evidence that people lived in there at different times, and there were communities engaged in transactions inside that place. So yeah, it was quite a place.
Okay. So one of the things, I know many writers have different kind of ways of going about finding a story. How do you do it? Do you have a specific process? Does it just come on a lark? How does?
I have never, for whatever reason, I've always had the opposite problem. I'm bombarded by too many story ideas, every day. I can't drive to the store to pick up a gallon of milk without getting 4 story ideas. It's just sort of the way my brain is wired. 99% of those die on the vine. I am I'm sort of an obsessive cultivator of my own notebook. I've kept notebooks since I was 7 or 8 years old. And today I think of it as just the notebook, capital T, capital N, as this one sort of chaotic and sprawling data bank.
Right.
And what I'll do is, on any given day, if a particular story notion occurs to me, I almost always have a notebook with me. I'll carry a small notebook on my person. There'll be a notebook in my car. There'll be a notebook, next to my reading chair at home. Sometimes there'll be I'll have a micro recorder with me sometimes if I'm driving and can't write. And I'll try to make some sort of an abbreviated note just to sort of pin down, so I don't, especially as my memory continues to erode, so that I can just pin it down. And as I say, so my notebooks are full. I've got 10,000 notebook pages filled with ideas that never came to fruition, that never gestated at all. And then every now and then there'll be one idea that is just it wants to be enfleshed in language. It pushes me and stays with me and is tenacious and sort of won't leave me alone. And that's when I know, that one would probably develop into a book. What I sometimes find, years ago I read an interview where Stephen King was asked either that question or a similar question about the origin of story ideas, and he said something that just struck so true to me. This is very often the case. This was the case, a story idea I had last week that just has really hit me hard. He said often it's when two disparate ideas suddenly come together in a way he didn't anticipate. They might be ideas for two different stories,
Right.
that would seem to have no connection whatsoever. They're not tied together by theme. They're not tied together by setting. They're not tied together by genre. They're not tied together by, whatever the author's intent is. And suddenly there's this epiphanous moment where they just merge, and they complete one another, and you go, "Wow!" This, all the circuit lights up completely. And you just kind of, and when that happens, that's just delightful. You sort of, I think the writer lives for those moments. And it's this great eureka moment where you just go, "Oh my God, that would be sweet. That." It's a very much an instinctual thing. It's very much it's a feeling. It's you just hear the internal bell go off, and you go, "Oh, okay, great,
Right.
we got something nice there."
Okay.